Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sessions with Paola. Today, I have the pleasure of sharing the stage with Dr. Claudia Rodriguez. She's originally from Colombia, raised in South Florida, and medically trained in Boston. And we're so lucky to now have her practicing down here in the state of Florida. Guys, so if you missed part one, we talked about the myths of addiction and what we need to understand better when it comes to the addiction field. But today, this episode is dedicated to all my weekend warriors. We are going to talk about the recreational use of cocaine. Guys, let's be real here. In Miami, I always say that it snows every weekend. And historically, the Miami Times had a really interesting article that talked about, events that took place that shaped Miami's identity. And they talked about the 1980s and how Miami became the cocaine capital of USA. And so it is all around our city. And I want us to really try to understand this from your perspective and to help us understand this a little bit better. So, Dr. Rodriguez, I want to start with asking you, how does cocaine work in the brain? You talked in part one, we talked a little bit about the reward system. Mm-hmm. So help us understand what's up.
Yeah. So cocaine specifically, actually a lot of the drugs that we use act in the same way in the brain. The reward system is really what is hijacked, impacted, made dysfunctional, imbalanced, whatever you want to call it. That's really the area of our brain that's impacted. But when we think about cocaine specifically, what cocaine does is that it blocks a molecule that sucks our dopamine back up. So let me take a moment to use my hand puppets, as I always call them. The way that our brain and we experience things is through the neurochemicals. And so typically there's two neurons, something gets released from one, this one grabs it with receptors, and then we have an experience. And that could be the experience of euphoria or joy, or what most people refer to as feeling high or intoxicated. And so what happens with dopamine in the setting of any pleasurable activity. So I am now a fan of acevichado sushi. So I'm sure that when I take a bite of one of those sushi rolls, my dopamine gets released. It comes into this space between the two neurons. Dopamine binds to a receptor and it creates the feeling of pleasure, joy, excitement. Once that reaction ends, this side sucks the dopamine back up into the neuron and then the feeling stops. And that happens as I continue to eat and experience that sensation of joy, pleasure. With cocaine use, what happens is the same thing happens. Dopamine gets released, but cocaine blocks this side from sucking it back in. So we have more dopamine living in this space, interacting with these receptors, and a much greater sensation of intoxication, euphoria, etc. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't come with its negative things. Cocaine also blocks the reuptake of things like serotonin, which can impact seizures, for example, norepinephrine, that can impact how we feel, anxiety, paranoia, and also kind of like the movement things that we see happening with cocaine intoxication. And additionally, if you don't just use cocaine once, but you continue using it over time, there are changes that happen over time that give you less of these receptors to interact with, and more of these to suck it back up. Just over time, that's what our brain has to adapt to. So that means that you're less able to experience pleasure when dopamine gets released in your brain naturally, or even in the setting of cocaine use. So over time, you need more. That leads to greater side effects. And then it's just like really hard to feel good.
Dr. and I wonder, I don't know if this is a question to ask, but you tell me, like, what is the average? So somebody may do a line of cocaine. What is the average time? And I don't even know if that makes sense, but what is the average time before somebody wants to use again? Like, how quickly does that go away?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's certain variables, right? So one, we want to think about, like, how are you administering the cocaine? Is it smoked? Is it insufflated or snorted? Is it injected? Those things are actually going to have a different impact in both how quickly the onset is and then how long that high lasts. But what's bad with cocaine is that you get a crash. And so what happens when you get a heightened dopamine release, too much dopamine activity, is there's also this kind of like balancing act your brain does, and then it leads to the crash or the feeling not so good. So why do people keep using? Why do binges happen? Because You feel that crash, you don't feel good, withdrawal, negative affect, we don't have to call it withdrawal, but just that negative experience that happens continues to drive the behavior. Remember, our reward system in our brain is meant to help us do things that feel good over and over and over again.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. And I wonder, because as we know, there's a lot of people who use cocaine only on the weekends. And sometimes they say, well, this only is on the weekends. I'm a weekend warrior. Therefore, it's not a big deal. But I wonder, when does it become, or when can it be considered an issue? What do people need to watch out for? What do they need to know?
Yeah.
Being that they're only using it on the weekend. And that's like a thing. Well, if it's on the weekend, that's okay. I'm okay.
So one of the things that I love about the weekend warrior term is that if you think about it, very few warriors go to battle and come home without a wound, right?
Oh, I love that.
So you have to think about, what am I doing to tend those emotional, spiritual, or physical wounds? Am I less tolerant of the people around me? Am I noticing that I have to sleep more? Am I noticing that, I might get things done at work, but am I noticing that I'm just like more frustrated doing it, or I'm not as attentive as I want to be? Whatever it is, you want to think about, what wounds am I having to tend to after my weekend? And then other things to take into account. Again, like, you want to look at yourself, your life, your mirror, right? Am I noticing that on Wednesday, I'm kind of looking at my watch, counting down the time until Friday so that I can use cocaine? We all get excited about Fridays, right? Like, there's songs about Fridays, we're excited, it's the weekend. But is it a different type of feeling that you're noticing that maybe has a little bit of anxiety because you just can't wait to use? Are you noticing that your weekend used to start on a Friday and suddenly you're starting on a Thursday? Are you noticing that you used to set yourself the boundary, if I'm only going to use cocaine if my friend has it, but now you're getting the number to the dealer and calling him up? What are you doing that's changing over the course of time? And how is that impacting how you feel about yourself, how you interact with your world? And what are you missing out on? I think those are really important things. For one person, it might be okay, but for another person, it's important to really evaluate those things, because sometimes as we're living it, it's hard to look in the mirror and notice what we're losing out on.
And it's so interesting that you say that, because what I notice in my practice, right? We live in Miami, guys, where overstimulation, you can always go somewhere, is literally the city that never stops. And during the pandemic, right? Like, I think that mirror, people had to look at it because a lot of places were closed. And so this thing about Thursday, I'm getting excited. All of a sudden, people started to deal with feelings of depression, irritability. So it kind of pushed people to look in that mirror in a more clear way. It's like, okay, we got to face what's really going on. I also noticed, Dr. Rodriguez, that a lot of people, drink and do cocaine, right? Alcohol and cocaine, they go to the party together.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that alcohol is a depressant, cocaine is a stimulant. And the other myth that I want you to talk to us about, because we hear this all the time, well, I got to do a line of coke in order for me to stay sober, or I'm drinking so much, I'm feeling a little tipsy, come with me to the bathroom. What do we need to better understand about that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, not all drugs kind of change biologically when you combine them with another drug, but cocaine and alcohol do have an interaction where a different type of molecule is created in the presence of alcohol when you're using cocaine. That molecule is called coca-ethylene. And that does not exist unless you're drinking alcohol. And so what happens with that molecule, it has the same impact on the dopamine sucker up transporter thing that I called earlier. It still has impacts on your heart. It has worse impacts on your liver, actually can be more toxic on your liver. And what it does is that it prolongs the intensity, or it prolongs the experience of the euphoria or the high. So that's why a lot of people enjoy that. And also people report that it actually decreases that like dysphoric or uncomfortable experience of the crash of cocaine, but it makes it a lot more toxic. And finally, what that molecule does is it also inhibits the breakdown of cocaine. So it allows the cocaine concentration to be in your system longer, higher. And so as a feeling, it feels better, different. But from a danger standpoint, we know that up to 1/4 of heart attacks that are non-fatal between 18 and 45-year-olds are related to cocaine. And so when you add alcohol to that mixture and you create this molecule that risk increases pretty drastically.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. That is, I love to do these episodes because I just learned something that I did not know. So thank you so much for
You're
sharing
welcome.
that. And of course, guys, because I'm a sex therapist, we're going to talk about sex. You talked a little bit about what people reported. And this is what I often hear. Either, right, like a lot of people use the term whiskey dick, right? Like, which is either, it's used for alcohol, but it's also used for cocaine. So I couldn't get an erection, but then other people report, I get this increased appetite. I masturbate for hours.
Yes.
I watch a lot of porn. I have this sexual appetite that I cannot stop. From your perspective, what's that about?
Oh, I mean, what you're hearing is actually what we have seen in research. So what you see in research is that people report a significant increase in sexual desire if they are using cocaine versus not. And there's a study that kind of like took people and they, either gave them a pill with cocaine or a pill that was not cocaine, but obviously didn't tell them which was what. And what they saw is that they had an increase in sexual desire over time. But what they also found was that there was a increased risk of being engaged in risky sexual behavior. So
Yes.
that impulsivity, right? What they found in the study was that people, despite recognizing that there was a risk of having an STD or getting an STD from a sexual encounter, their likelihood of using a condom decreased depending on the time which it took to get a condom. So if you had a condom readily accessible, people that were using cocaine would probably use it. But the farther away as time went, the more impulsive the nature was. And so we know that there's a much increased risk of sexual behaviors. And also with HIV, the way that cocaine interacts with your immune system, the risk increases greatly in like having bad outcomes from HIV and other infectious diseases. And then you mentioned kind of like the erectile dysfunction or having a difficulty obtaining an erection. So with long-term use of cocaine, there's a lot of things that happen. I think for one, I already talked about how it impacts our reward system and how it's harder for us to enjoy natural rewards when we have used something for a prolonged period of time. So sex will just simply not feel as joyful if you have used cocaine to have sex for a long time. There's an emotional, cognitive, and then there's also a very neurobiological basis for that. And then what does cocaine do to our blood vessels? It constricts them. It increases our heart rate and our blood pressure, and it constricts our blood vessels, which means it makes them really tight. What does a good erection need? The complete opposite of that. It needs oxygen to the organ, and it needs nice and dilated blood vessels. If you don't have that, your erection is not going to be a happy camper.
Oh, you're not going to have a lot of fun. Guys, thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez, for joining us today, guys. I hope that you're taking some things away from this talk. And remember, please feel free to send us your questions. If there's anything that you heard or you want to share an experience, I will make sure that I answer your questions either as sessions or in my Instagram. Dr. Rodriguez, how can people find you?
So you can find me if you have any questions actually for me, or you're interested in learning more, or you or someone you know is interested in getting treatment. My email is drrodriguez@reclaimsunshine.com. Reclaim Sunshine Psychiatry is my practice, and so there will be more to come, but if you Google that, you're going to see some stuff there, and I'll eventually create an Instagram page and so on. So it's great to be here. Thank you so much. I hope your audience is getting a lot of helpful information from this. And remember, there is no shame in having the disease of addiction. It is a chronic disease. Treatment works. Treatment is out there. Doesn't have to be me. It's lots of great doctors and physicians and nurse practitioners and therapists exist. So I hope this was valuable to you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you, guys. And remember, if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure that you subscribe to Sessions with Paola. And thank you again for joining us. Bienvenidos.